Be right with you. How, as you know, your life is going to be far from ordinary. As the eldest son of King Henry IV, you are the heir to his throne, even if he had to usurp Richard II to claim it. But you won't be facing the same impediments he did. You have the right to succeed him. But the way you've lived your life up until now has many people wondering, especially your father, what kind of king you'll make. The best advice I can give you is to tell you that before you become a king, you must first learn how to become a man. That means growing up and not hanging out with questionable characters like Falstaff, Bardolph, Peto, and Poins. As a grown man, I'm challenging you to ask yourself some questions. Will I dig the same things that turned me on as a kid? I'm talking about hanging out in bawdy houses and taverns with riffraff. Ask yourself this. Will I look back and say I wish I hadn't done what I did? I'm talking about taking part in highway robberies along with the rabble you surrounded yourself with as friends. Also ask yourself, will I joke around and role-play with that fat knight Falstaff about how I will answer my father when he questions me about my behavior? And I know it might seem like a long way off, but you must realize that the woman you marry will become the future Queen of England. So ask yourself, will I look for the same things in a woman that I dig in a girl? You might not even have the luxury of marrying for love, and she might not even speak the same language as you. Ask yourself, will I settle down fast, or will I first want to travel the world before I take over as king? Perhaps visit the Holy Land as your father intended to. Of course, that's not always an option, especially if war breaks out again with France. Remember that Catherine of Valois could be a very eligible marriage partner for you, especially in settling military conflicts between your two nations. But you don't speak French very well, nor does she speak English. If you had to marry her to bring about a peace, ask yourself, can I and will I love my wife for the rest of my life? Sure, you can say to yourself, now I'm young and free, but how will it be when it's your turn to wear the crown? You must realize that these days won't last forever, and it's kind of sad to leave old acquaintances behind. But your country is waiting to see how you will do as king. So before that happens, I challenge you to ask yourself once and for all, Hal, what will I be when I grow up to be a man? In the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 15, we read the story of the prodigal son, who left home and wasted all his sustenance on harlots until he was starving and pitiful. And when he returned, his father took compassion on him and was joyous because his son, who was spiritually dead, had come to life again. It's easy to see why Shakespeare drew so many references from this gospel and put them to good use in Henry IV, Part 1. So let's take a look at the plot. From the very beginning of the play, Henry IV's reign is beset by problems. First, he hopes to make atonement for his part in usurping the throne from Richard II and also being partially responsible for his death, and making a crusade to the Holy Land. But that becomes impossible because he is experiencing trouble on his borders with Scotland and Wales. In addition, he finds himself increasingly at odds with Edmund Mortimer, this is Richard II's chosen heir, as well as the Percy family, who helped him to ascend to the throne and now feel slighted and unappreciated. King Henry is also disturbed by the behavior of Hal, his eldest son and heir, who will eventually become Henry V. Hal doesn't spend much time at the royal court and instead prefers to drink in taverns and associate with low-born and disreputable companions. This makes him an object of scorn and embarrassment to his father and the nobles and puts his succession in question. Hal's chief associate and surrogate father figure is Sir John Falstaff, a cowardly, drunken, and thieving knight whose quick wit and charm fascinates the young prince. King Henry and Hotspur have a falling out after a political disagreement over the treatment of hostages. Against the king's orders, Hotspur refuses to release hostages taken in action against the Scots. In retaliation, King Henry will not pay Owain Glendower, a Welsh rebel, the ransom for Hotspur's brother-in-law, Edmund Mortimer. This quarrel and the king's harsh treatment of the entire House of Percy drives them to ally with the Welsh and Scot rebels, and they resolve to depose Henry IV. Meanwhile, Hal hangs out with Falstaff and his cohorts at the Boar's Head Tavern. Although Falstaff and Hal are friendly, in a poignant soliloquy, Hal makes it clear that he will not continue in his present lifestyle when he becomes king. In addition, Hal plans to earn his high place in court by proving himself to his father. He believes that by suddenly changing his ways, he will be even more popular with the nobility than if he had behaved more respectably in his youth. Nevertheless, he is happy to carry out a plot against Falstaff. After a highway robbery, Hal and Poins slip away from Falstaff, disguise themselves, and rob Falstaff purely for the fun of hearing the older man lie his way out of it later, after which Hal returns the stolen money. As the rebel uprising of Mortimer and the House of Percy grows, Prince Hal reconciles with his father and gets command of an army. He vows to fight and kill the rebel Hotspur and orders Falstaff to recruit and lead a group of foot soldiers. Falstaff uses this appointment to line his own pockets by taking bribes from those who do not want to be pressed into service and who are wealthy enough to buy their own freedom. As a result, he winds up only recruiting the very poor whose wages he withholds. They all meet at the Battle of Shrewsbury, which is a crucial moment for everyone involved. If the rebels are not defeated outright, they will obtain significant advantage, and they can call upon other forces to help them break a stalemate or a victory for the rebels. Though Henry IV's troops outnumber the rebels, Hotspur, who is wild and skilled in battle, decides to lead the rebel army himself. During the battle, the king is singled out by the Douglas. Prince Hal and Hotspur duel, and in a crucial turning point, Hal prevails, killing Hotspur in single combat. Meanwhile, Falstaff plays dead on the battlefield to avoid fighting the Douglas. But after Hal leaves Hotspur's body on the field, miraculously, Falstaff revives and realizes that since he's alone, he stabs Hotspur's body in the thigh and claims credit for killing him. Hal allows Falstaff to claim the honor of the kill. Soon after Hal's generous gesture, Falstaff states that he wants to amend his life. Fat chance, pun intended. The play ends after the Battle of Shrewsbury. The death of Hotspur and the military victory strike a serious blow against the rebel fighters. King Henry is thrilled with the outcome, and he executes Thomas Percy, the Earl of Worcester, who was one of his chief enemies, though he was formerly one of his greatest friends. His son Hal practices mercy by ordering the Douglas, who is now a prisoner of war, to be released without ransom. And although the rebellion, now led by the Archbishop of York and the Earl of Northumberland, continues, the play ends with Henry IV's commitment to make sure that their victory is complete, saying, "Rebellion in this land shall lose his sway, meeting the check of such another day. And since this business so fair is done, let us not leave till all our own be won." When we get back, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Henry IV, Part 1. Let's take a look at some of the major characters in this play. First, Henry IV is Henry Bolingbroke, who we first saw in Richard II when he usurped that king, his cousin, to become King of England. And although he is a better king, the people who put him in power have now become his greatest threat. Hal, also known as Prince Harry, also known as the Prince of Wales, is Henry IV's oldest son and heir to the throne. But there's a major problem because Hal has spent his youth among riffraff and reprobates, much to his father's chagrin. Hotspur, also known as Harry Percy, also known as Henry Percy, is the son of the Earl of Northumberland. He is a hothead who loves to go to war. He flies off the handle and is argumentative just for argument's sake. Still, Henry IV wishes he had a son like Hotspur instead of Hal, and that is up until the time that the king and Hotspur get into an argument over prisoners. Thomas Percy, also known as the Earl of Worcester, is Hotspur's uncle. The Percy family is the primary threat to the king, who, after being slighted, mount rebel forces to remove Henry IV from the throne. There are also other combatants whom the king must face off against. Chief among them is Lord Edmund Mortimer, also called the Earl of March, who was Richard II's chosen heir to the throne, and so he poses a great threat to Henry IV. The king must also battle against Owain Glendower, Sir Richard Vernon, and the Earl of Douglas, among others. And finally, we have one of Shakespeare's greatest creations, the fat knight known as Sir John Falstaff. Falstaff is a pickpocket, a rogue, a drunkard, a mooch, and a liar who, along with his cronies Bardolph, Peto, and Ned Poins, hang out in taverns with Hal during his younger days. Hal seems to be fascinated by Falstaff and finds him amusing. Hal also seems to view Falstaff as some sort of mentor or father figure who teaches him the ways of commoners and vagabonds. He loves to make sport at Falstaff's expense, but also allows this man a great deal of latitude and protects him from the law. However, it's clear from what Hal has to say in his first major soliloquy that he knows that when he becomes king, his association with these criminals will have to come to an end. Coming up, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes in Henry IV, Part 1. In Henry IV, Part 1, Shakespeare keeps his characters in three separate groups for most of the play. First, we have Henry IV surrounded by his loyal followers who focus on fighting the rebels. Next, we have the rebels themselves, including the Percy family, Glendower, Mortimer, Vernon, and the Douglas. Finally, we have the Boar's Head Tavern group of highwaymen including Falstaff, Bardolph, Peto, and Ned Poins. And for much of this play, this is where we will see Hal, who, despite his title, is really the central character in the play. This was an excellent plot device because by keeping his characters in separate groups for the majority of the play, Shakespeare builds suspense and anticipation as the audience knows that eventually these groups will be interacting with one another, leading to the climax of the play. Also, since a history play can tend to be a little bit dull, Shakespeare inserted the Boar's Head Tavern group to lighten the seriousness of the impending battle and infuse some humor into the play. One could easily make the argument that Hal and Falstaff are the true stars of Henry IV, Part 1, and not the king. There are many memorable scenes in this play as well. In Act 1, Scene 2, Hal gives his "I know you all" soliloquy, which allows the audience to know his thoughts but still keep his associates in the dark. Here it is. "I know you all, and will a while uphold the unyoked humor of your idleness. Yet herein will I imitate the sun." Now, this is a play on words because he's the son, S-O-N, of the king, but the sun, S-U-N, is also a symbol for the king. "Who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, that when he please again to be himself, being wanted he may be more wondered at by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapors that did seem to strangle him. If all the year were playing holidays, to sport would be as tedious as to work. But when they seldom come, they wished for come, and nothing pleaseth but rare accidents. So, when this loose favor I throw off, and pay the debt I never promised, by how much better than my word I am, by so much shall I falsify men's hopes, and like bright metal on a sullen ground, my reformation, glittering on my fault, shall show more goodly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set it off. I'll so offend to make offense a skill, redeeming time when men think least I will. Hal knows that he's perceived as a vagrant and a vagabond and a wastrel. But when the time arises for him to take the throne, he knows that he will take it seriously and he will shock his detractors. And finally, in Act 3, Scene 3, there's a great scene included in the Boar's Head Tavern when Falstaff is bragging about his good qualities. As you will see, this is really Falstaff putting on a show and entertaining his cronies, and it demonstrates why they are willing to put up with him even though he's such a scoundrel. Here he is bragging about himself. Bardolph, am I not fallen away vilely since this last action? Do I not bate? Do I not dwindle? Why, my skin hangs about me like an old lady's loose gown. I am withered like an old Applejohn. Well, I repent, and that suddenly, when I am in some liking. I shall be out of heart shortly, and then I shall have no strength to repent. And I have not forgotten what the inside of a church is made of. I am a peppercorn, a brewer's horse. The inside of a church, company, villainous company, hath been the spoil of me. Bardolph says, Sir John, you are so fretful, you cannot live long. And he continues, Why, there it is. Come sing me a bawdy song, make me merry. I was as virtuously given as a gentleman need be. Virtuous enough, swore little, diced not above 7 times a week, went to a bawdy house not once in a quarter of an hour, paid money that I borrowed 3 or 4 times, lived well and in good compass, and now I live out of all order, out of all compass. When we get back, we'll look at some of the major themes in Henry IV, Part 1. In this play, we see several instances of loyalty and appreciation. By the way, I never thought much of this speech until I heard Sir John Gielgud deliver it. I encourage you to look it up online. It's definitely worth hearing. Listen to Hotspur defend his loyalty to Henry IV in Act 1, Scene 3, as he explains why he didn't turn over his prisoners. My liege, I did deny no prisoners, but I remember when the fight was done, when I was dry with rage and extreme toil, breathless and faint, leaning on my sword, came there a certain lord, neat and trimly dressed, fresh as a bridegroom, and his chin new reaped, showed like a stubble land at harvest home. He was perfumed like a milliner, and twixt his finger and his thumb he held a pouncet box. This is a perfume box with a perforated lid, which ever and anon he gave his nose and took it away again, who therewith angry, when it next came there, took it in snuff, and still he smiled and talked. And as the soldiers bore dead bodies by, he called them untaught knaves, unmannerly, to bring a slovenly, unhandsome course betwixt the wind and his nobility. With many holiday and lady terms he questioned me, amongst the rest demanded my prisoners in your majesty's behalf. I then, all smarting with my wounds being cold, to be so pestered with a popinjay, out of my grief and my impatience answered neglectingly, I know not what, he should or he should not, for he made me mad to see him shine so brisk and smell so sweet, and talk so like a waiting gentlewoman of guns and drums and wounds, God save the mark, and telling me the sovereignest thing on earth was parmaceti, that is the fat from the head of a sperm whale, for an inward bruise, and that it was great pity, so it was, this villainous saltpeter should be digged out of the bowels of the harmless earth, which many a good tall fellow had destroyed, so cowardly, and but for these vile guns, he would himself have been a soldier. This bald, unjointed chat of his, my lord, I answered indirectly, as I said, and I beseech you, let not his report come current for an accusation betwixt my love and your high majesty. As for appreciation, this is at the heart of the problem between Henry IV and the Percy family, Mortimer, Glendower, and the Douglas. King Henry is in a sticky situation because Mortimer was Richard II's appointed heir, so Henry's refusal to pay the ransom for Hotspur's brother-in-law, Edmund Mortimer, puts Hotspur in a difficult situation. As a result, the Percy family and their cohorts decide to start an uprising against Henry IV. As you can see, a lack of appreciation for all the Percys did to help Henry usurp the throne from Richard II is now coming back to haunt him. Let's look at two more themes in this play: freedom and responsibility. Young Hal is in an awkward position because he is the heir to the English throne, but yet he's still enjoying his freedom, even though he knows that it will have to come to an end before he becomes the king. We've already seen in Act 1, Scene 2, that he's already acknowledged that he's going to have to change his ways. These are signs of maturity and growth, recognizing that he will have to take his responsibilities seriously as a king. And even before his crown, he demonstrates his prowess on the battlefield by slaying Hotspur. On the other hand, Falstaff has no interest in changing his ways or giving up his freedoms, as he thinks that once Hal becomes the king, Falstaff will be able to get away with whatever he wants. When the two of them role-play what Hal will say to his father about his association with Falstaff, Sir Jack paints himself in a glowing light. This is the "Banish not Jack Falstaff" speech from Act 2, Scene 5. The prince is playing the king. "That villainous, abominable misleader of youth, Falstaff, that old white-bearded Satan." And Falstaff, playing the prince, says, "My lord, the man I know." The prince, "I know thou dost." Falstaff as the prince, "But to say I know more harm in him than in myself were to say more than I know. That he is old, the more the pity. His white hairs do witness it. But that he is, saving your reverence, a whoremaster, that I utterly deny. If sack and sugar be a fault, God help the wicked. If to be old and merry be a sin, then many an old host that I know is damned. If to be fat be to be hated, then Pharaoh's kine, which is lean, are to be loved. No, my good lord, banish Peto, banish Bartolf, banish Poins. But for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, and therefore more valiant, being that he is old Jack Falstaff, banish not him thy Harry's company, banish not him thy Harry's company, banish plump Jack, and banish all the world. And the prince replies, I do. I will. And we will see him do this at the very end of Henry IV, Part 2. Coming up, we'll look at some of the most powerful lines in Henry IV, Part 1. Although it might seem like a minor point, I want to address something that Hotspur says to his wife, Lady Percy, while he's resting his head on her lap and listening to Lady Mortimer sing in Welsh. By the way, Lady Mortimer doesn't speak any English, and her husband Mortimer doesn't speak any Welsh, yet they seem to have a very happy, loving marriage. I wonder what Shakespeare was trying to say about that and communication. Meanwhile, Lady Percy says to her husband, Now God help thee. And Hotspur replies, To the Welsh lady's bed. Lady Percy quickly asks, What's that? But Hotspur dismisses her, saying, Peace, she sings. While Shakespeare chose not to pursue this rude and disrespectful remark any further, it's easy to see how this could have easily changed the entire trajectory of the play. After all, Leontes in The Winter's Tale accused his wife of adultery with far less provocation. It seems more likely that Shakespeare just wanted to demonstrate another example of Hotspur shooting his mouth off, most likely just to get a rise out of his underappreciated wife. And since he only ever thinks about the glory of war, it's unlikely that he ever intended to pursue Lady Mortimer. Nevertheless, Shakespeare did include it in Act 3, Scene 1 for a reason, and we are still discussing what it meant today. It would be a shame not to include Falstaff's catechism on honor among Henry IV's most powerful lines. It takes place in Act 5, Scene 1, when Falstaff reluctantly finds himself in the middle of a battle, and Hal says to him, Why, you owe God a death. And Falstaff says, 'Tis not due yet. I would be loath to pay him before his day. What need I be so forward with him that calls not on me? Well, 'tis no matter, honor pricks me on. Yea, but how If honor prick me off when I come, how then? Can honor set to a leg? No. Or an arm? No. Or take away the grief of a wound? No. Honor hath no skill in surgery, then? No. What is honor? A word. What is in that word, honor? What is that honor? Air. A trim reckoning. Who hath it? He that died a Wednesday. Does he feel it? No. Doth he hear it? No. 'Tis insensible then? Yea, to the dead. But will it not live with the living? No. Why, detraction will not suffer it. Therefore, I'll none of it. Honor is a mere scutcheon, and so ends my catechism. By the way, catechism is a question and answer session usually used to learn Catholic doctrine. Coming up, we'll look at some major turning points and correlations in Henry IV, Part 1. There are several major turning points in this play. First, we have Hal's I Know You All speech in Act 1, Scene 2, which sets the tone for what we will see when he becomes Henry V. In Act 1, Scene 3, there's a showdown between Henry IV and the Percy family over the king's refusal to ransom Mortimer. This leads to all of the following rebellions and challenges to his throne. In Act 4, Scene 1, Hotspur, the Douglas, Worcester, and Vernon learn that Northumberland is sick and cannot make it to the battle. He also doesn't send any troops in his absence. Next, the rebels learn that Glendower is not able to come for another 14 days. Despite the terrible odds, Hotspur still wants to fight, just as Henry V chose to do in the Battle of Agincourt. The biggest difference is Henry V was victorious, and Hotspur meets his demise at the hands of Hal. Another great turning point in this play occurs in Act 5, Scene 2, when Worcester insists that Hotspur not know about the king's kind offers because he doesn't want to take a chance that Hotspur will back down again from the fight. This one action could have resolved many of the conflicts and prevented an enormous amount of bloodshed. It's similar to the one-to-one combat offer that Mark Antony made to Octavius Caesar, which was refused outright. Finally, we see Hal show mercy and ransom the Douglas when he could have had him executed. We'll see another similar gesture by Hal when he becomes king in Henry IV, Part 2. Everyone thinks he's going to punish his childhood tutor, the Lord Chief Justice, because he was so hard on him as a child. But instead, Harry asks him to be just as strict to his own son and to be a father figure and mentor to himself as a king. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Shakespeare used a lot of correlations between Hal before he becomes king and Jesus Christ. Hal spent his time with vagrants, pickpockets, innkeepers, and thieves. Christ associated with murderers, adulteresses, fishermen, and thieves in hopes of inspiring them to better themselves and sin no more. Hal urges them to change their ways, but doesn't insist that they do so. And in both cases, we see that many are called, but few are chosen. When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts about Henry IV, Part 1. In preparing to do this episode, I did some research and I found out some interesting facts about Henry IV. For instance, not only was Henry IV the first Lancastrian king of England, he was also the first king of England who spoke English as their first language. Prior to that, the king spoke French. Henry IV was also the first monarch to permit burnings at the stake as a form of execution. The oil used to anoint Henry IV at his coronation was believed to have been given to Thomas Becket by the Virgin Mary. Owain Glendower was the last Welshman to hold the title of Prince of Wales, the same title that Henry V held. Interestingly, while Shakespeare chose to pit Hotspur against Hal as rivals of a similar age for theatrical purposes, in reality, Hotspur was actually 21 years older than Hal and of the same generation as Hal's father, Henry IV. Shakespeare originally used other names for John Falstaff, Bardolph, and Peto. Falstaff's original name was Oldcastle, based on the real deceased Protestant, but Shakespeare changed it because his descendants, still living in Shakespeare's time, objected to the use. Oldcastle's replacement name was taken from Sir John Falstaff, a coward who fortunately died without leaving any living relatives. Bardolph was known as Russell, and Peto was originally known as Harvey. Their names were changed, no doubt, for similar reasons. And finally, the common expression, discretion is the better part of valor, has its roots in Henry IV, Part 1. In Act 5, Scene 4, Falstaff says, after playing dead to escape being killed, the better part of valor is discretion, and the which better part, I have saved my life. When we return, we'll look at some of the great actors in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of this play. All right, now let's take a look at some of the actors who played in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry IV, Part 1. Please note that since Shakespeare chose to follow the history of English kings in this group of 4 plays, comprised of Richard II, Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and finishing this segment with Henry V, we'll see that the BBC used many of the same actors to continue their roles throughout the first tetralogy. John Finch, who played Henry Bolingbroke in Richard II in 1978, returned to play Henry IV in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 in 1979. He also played Don Pedro in 1984 in Much Ado About Nothing. David Gwilym, who played Hal, continues his role in Henry IV Part 2, where he becomes King Henry V. He also portrays that title role in Henry V in 1979. Robert Brown, who plays Sir Walter Blunt, also played the Earl of Pembroke in the 1984 version of The Life and Death of King John. Tim Pigott-Smith, who played Hotspur, or Harry Percy, also played Lord Angelo in Measure for Measure in 1979. Robert Edwards, who plays Prince John of Lancaster, continues his role straight through Henry V. Anthony Quayle, who plays Falstaff, continues his role in Henry IV Part 2, but is replaced by Richard Griffiths in the 1982 version of The Merry Wives of Windsor. Gordon Costello, who plays Bardolph, continues his role not only through Henry V and the 1982 version of The Merry Wives of Windsor, but also plays a fisherman of Pentapolis in the 1984 version of Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Richard Owens, who plays Owain Glendower, also played Sir Thomas Mowbray in the 1978 version of Richard II. And finally, Brenda Bruce, who plays the continuing role of Mistress Quickly in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 and Henry V, and the first witch in the 1983 version of Macbeth, was replaced as Mistress Quickly by Elizabeth Spriggs in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Stay tuned for today's trivia challenge, which is called I'm a Little Short. Now it's time for today's trivia challenge, which is called I'm a Little Short. In several of Shakespeare's plays, he specifically notes that one character is taller than the other. Name which of these 2 characters is shorter than the other one in these 3 clues. Number 1, Helena or Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Number 2, Rosalind or Celia in As You Like It. And number 3, Verges or Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. When we get back, we'll have the answers, along with some relevant lessons from Henry IV, Part 1. All right, let's see how you did in today's trivia challenge called I'm a Little Short. In several of Shakespeare's plays, he specifically notes that one character is taller than the other. Name which of these 2 characters is shorter than the other in these 3 clues. Number 1, Helena and Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The right answer is Hermia. Number 2, Rosalind and Celia in As You Like It. The correct answer is Celia. And number 3, Verges or Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. The correct answer is Verges. Now let's finish up with some relevant lessons from Henry IV, Part 1. First, leadership carries with it the price of responsibility. Even if Hal intended to change his ways, he still could have reassured his father sooner by demonstrating a more serious demeanor in his younger days. It's even more important that we do this if we expect to move up for a promotion, unless you also happen to be an heir apparent. Second, choose your associates wisely. As motivational speaker Burke Hedges' mother used to say to him when he was growing up, "Tell me who you hang out with, and I'll tell you who you are." And third, in this play, the rebellion got started as a result of a perceived lack of appreciation for the Percy family's help in getting Henry Bolingbroke to become King of England. Remember to always demonstrate respect and appreciation for others. As Maya Angelou famously said, "People will forget what you say, and people will forget what you do, but they will never forget the way you make them feel." I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo and Shakespeare. Please join me next time when a pair of star-crossed lovers try to overcome an ancient family feud.